Hello and welcome to the BucketLister Podcast. Join your host Keith Crockford along with special guests who have travelled the world, here to share stories of their adventures and plenty of inspo to add to your bucket list. Now, let's get into today's episode.
Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of the BucketLister Podcast. I am back today, Keith Crockford, your host, but today I am back again on my own because I'm actually away on my holidays, so I didn't want to bother anybody else. So I just thought I'd record this quick podcast for you, and I'm going to answer one question that's come up quite a bit over the last few weeks, and that's surrounding Lukla Airport, and is it the most dangerous airport in the world, and how do we actually get there? So that's what I'm going to cover off in the podcast today. Like I said, I'm on my holidays. I'm away with friends and family, and we're actually over in Spain, where I did a podcast from a few weeks ago where we were talking about our Spanish adventure in the Costa Blanca. So I come out here quite a bit, and I'm back out here again for a couple of weeks, and we've done quite a few exciting things while we've been out here, which has been really good. But like I said, the topic for today is discussing Lukla Airport, or the Tenzing Norgay airport now, or Tenzing Hillary Airport as it's now described. Now, if you've probably seen videos of it on YouTube. If you're interested in the Everest Base Camp, then you've definitely seen the runway to this airport and heard the stories of the world's most dangerous airport. Now, why is it classed as the world's most dangerous airport? And yes, there have been accidents, but it has got safer over the years. And the main reasons why it is so dangerous is because of the elevation of the landing strip itself, which is, the airport itself sits at an altitude of 2,846 meters. So obviously that causes some issues in itself. But obviously the other main issue is the fact that the runway is so short. So the runway is only actually 527 meters long, which doesn't really give the pilots time to either slow down or speed up, so that they've got to get it exactly right when they come in. The airport was originally built in 1967, and it was constructed under the watchful eye of Sir Edmund Hillary, and he intended to build it on flat farmland. However, the local farmers didn't want to give up their land, so Hillary ended up buying the land where it is now for the price of $2,650 when he bought it, and got the locals to come in and help him build the runway. Now, the runway was not actually paved until 2001. It was just a soil-resistant runway up until that point. So it's only relatively new in terms of its current, how it sits now. So it's only been, like I said, since 2001 that they've actually had a tarmac paved facility there. The biggest problem with Lukla Airport is the weather itself. Obviously, being at the altitude that it's at, this can change really, really quickly. And the size of the planes that are landing don't have the equipment that larger planes have. So the problem you have when you are on an Everest Base Camp trek generally is that Lukla Airport itself just gets closed. It can be closed for days and days and days because of the cloud cover. Now, whenever I'm out there is a live, if you go onto YouTube and type in Lukla Airport, I'll put a link into the show notes. But there is a live camera to Lukla Airport, and you can literally normally see whether or not you're going to be flying that day or not when you're out there. And it can cause quite a lot of stress to your trip, because obviously you need to get there. The journey and the drive to get to Lukla is, well, it just adds days onto your itinerary with an extra trek, because there is no road currently to Lukla itself. I mean, they are supposedly building one, But this has been going on now for quite a few years. So we did write a blog post on it, which again, I'll put a link to that into the show notes so you can have a look at it. But like I said, it does cause a lot of stress when you're stranded for a couple of days not being able to fly. And this issue's been heightened over the last especially last year, and then the spring season of this year, and it's continuing into the autumn season, is that you can no longer fly from Kathmandu to Lukla. You now have to take the dark drive to Ramechhap and get the flight from there. Now, the reason why this is because the Nepalese government have decided that they want to reduce the number of small plane traffic at the international airport in Kathmandu. And the problem that this causes is when flights are being delayed from Lukla, it's very hard to stick to a schedule. And what this has meant is that obviously with lots of international flights coming into Nepal, the traffic at the international airport is just getting too much. So during the two main trekking seasons, i.e. March through to May and late September through to early November, you can't fly from Kathmandu to Lukla. You have to take the journey to Ramechhap. Now, Ramechhap's getting better. I remember I've been to Ramechhap a couple of times because of flight issues previous to this, and there is no accommodation, or there's very little accommodation in Ramechhap, which again causes big problems when flights have been delayed. Because if you get stuck in Ramechhap, like I say, there is not a lot of accommodation there. So what does this mean for you and for your flights? Well, from our perspective, we haven't got any option. As a tour operator, we have to plan to go from Ramechhap. Now, there are people out there who are saying that their providers can provide them with flights from Kathmandu to Lukla. Now, occasionally, there are a couple of flights from Kathmandu to Lukla. And this generally is when flights need to go back to Kathmandu because the planes need servicing. They've got to go and pick up supplies from Kathmandu. So occasionally there is the odd flight that is still going from Kathmandu to Lukla. But priority is certainly being given to the flights from Ramechhap. So if you are promised a flight from Kathmandu to Lukla, just please be a little bit wary about it, because I think people are promising them to try and get business. But I don't necessarily think that those flights are going to go potentially. You might still end up going to Ramechhap to actually get a flight. In terms of getting to Ramechhap, and we did this for our first few trips that we ran, is most operators are getting their guests up at like 3 o'clock in the morning to do the overnight trip to Ramechhap, and then getting one of the first flights out of Ramechhap in the morning to Lukla. It's not a very nice journey. Like, if you get travel sick, please take some travel sick tablets with you. The road is very windy. The road is very bumpy. Again, they are improving it, but in its current state, it is not the nicest of drives. And I also think as well, like, you're not going to sleep very well on the bus, and then you've got your first day's trekking of the Everest Base Camp trek that day. So what we quickly did is we quickly changed our itinerary to leave in the afternoon in Ramechhap, from Kathmandu to Ramechhap. So actually we got to Ramechhap, and you had time to have a meal, and then you could go to sleep, and then you could get up early in the morning ready for one of the first flights out. And I find that this is a much nicer way of doing things. You just feel more prepared in the morning for your trip. To start trekking, you haven't been up since 2:30 in the morning, traveling to then get a flight to then go and do a day's walking. So if you are looking to go out, that is an option. I also think if you're going out and you are going out, this is where going in a group is an advantage, because when you go out there in a group, you can, if there is a problem with flights, like we've been delayed in Ramechhap for another day, another 2 days sometimes. And our provider in Nepal has kept our accommodation, is sorted our accommodation. So our guests have still had a bed to lay in and go to sleep in on those occasions. So I think like that is one of the advantages when you're on an Everest Base Camp trek, of going as a group or with a local provider. So you have got that backup if you need it, because it is a real problem if you cannot get on the flight. And likewise, if your flight gets cancelled, what you don't want to do is then be bumped to one of the later flights the next day, because if you are going out, you really, really want to be on the first flights of the day. And if you've got a really good provider who's got a great relationship with the flight agents and with the airlines that fly into Everest Base Camp, into Lukla, then you've got more chance of going the next day. And obviously that's the same reversed. So when you're flying back from Lukla, you will be flying back to Ramechhap, and then again the following day, that day, then you've then got to drive back to Kathmandu that night. Another question that comes up is about helicopters and what happens about helicopters. Now, obviously, it is easier for a helicopter to land in Lukla than it is sometimes for an aeroplane with the weather, with the cloud. They can fly lower, and you've got more chance of that happening. But obviously there is then a cost involved with that. And it's one thing I would say to people is have that prepared in the back of your mind, that if you don't want to be losing rest days whilst you're on the trek and you've got a very tight schedule, then upgrading your flight to a helicopter, if your flight was to get cancelled, is a really good thing to do. Obviously, again, if you're with a group, it has to be a whole group's decision. So sometimes traveling on your own, that would be much easier to make that call. Because for us, for example, if we are going with the group, we need the whole group to go on the helicopter. We can't just take half and half, stay and wait, because it could be the group are then 2-3 days apart. So have that in the back of your head. Now, generally, if the flights get cancelled, then we can get a refund on those flights, and the cost of what we've paid for those flights can then go towards the helicopter part of that flight. It works out normally around about another $250 to then upgrade it to get the helicopter from the plane. So just have that in the back of your mind, that is a potential additional cost for your trip, in terms of you might need to budget for that in terms of that. So I would always advise people to have that in the back of their mind. I mean, on the way up, it's not so bad, because you've kind of got a spare day that you can catch up on. Like, we can still keep the rest days on our itinerary and reduce coming back down by a day to make up for it. So you're not going to lose anything out on it if the flight is only delayed by a day. Any more than that, then potentially you're going to start eating into your rest days. Where it does become more important is potentially when you're coming back, if you've got your return flight booked to get back to the UK or the US or wherever you're going, you might not have as much leeway on your way home as you've got on the way out. So just be prepared that potentially you do have that additional cost, maybe, if you want to get your trek in. Now, obviously, you've gone out there to do the trek. You want to get to Everest Base Camp. So for a lot of people, they are happy to pay that. But like I said, for us, it needs to be a whole group thing. We can't do a half and half. So just bear that in mind. But you will certainly enjoy the aeroplane flight. You'll certainly enjoy a helicopter flight as well. It's quite exciting to go on a helicopter. But the views you get are just stunning. Is it the world's most dangerous airport in the world? The accidents have been reduced. I mean, there are 2020. Obviously, the flights were down, so they're still looking at data from 2019. And there were over 130,000 people flew into Lukla Airport, which for a small airport in the middle of the Khumbu region is a completely amazing number, really, in terms of how many people use that airport. It's exciting. It's thrilling, coming into the runway. And obviously the runway as you come in is uphill. And then as you leave, the runway is obviously downhill to fly out because there's a big mountain at the end of it. So you can only come in and off the opposite direction. But, it is certainly a big part of the trip. Like, I've taken lots of people to Everest Base Camp now over the years, and it's probably the one thing that most people get nervous about. We did, Jake and I did a podcast a few months back now about packing for Everest Base Camp. And a lot of that conversation was around about how to get your baggage allowance in for the flight. So if you haven't listened to that podcast yet, please go back and check that one out. But it is part of the expedition. The trip itself is to take that flight. Now, some people are super scared of it, and they will not do the flight, and they will then take the drive to Jiri and then take the extra 3-day trek from Jiri to start then at Lukla. Obviously, if you are petrified of flying, that is an option for you. But you're going to be needing to allow another 5-6 days onto your itinerary to get that done, which with a 16-day trip already, you're then going to be going into a 3-week plus trip if you want to go and do that bit. So there are things to think about with the flight to Lukla. But like I say, most people, once they're there, it's one of their favorite parts of the trip. And, the photos and the views out the windows and the things you see in the Himalayas. And, it's not that bad. It's a little bit bumpy. But once you're up in the air and once you're on the way back down, once you've taken off and once you've landed, the bit in the middle is the bit to really enjoy and really get the most out of. But I think, like I said earlier, it is definitely one of the highlights of the Everest Base Camp trip. Like I said, the only bit now is obviously we've now got that additional drive to Ramechhap. But if it means that there's less chance of flights getting cancelled, more flights going, then potentially it can only be a good thing. And I think, to be honest, it's here to stay for a while. I think unless the Nepalese government build a local airport in Kathmandu that services all of the domestic flights, I think that's the only time potentially that it will change. Obviously, if you don't want to fly to Ramechhap and you are going as a private group, then helicopters are still flying from Kathmandu. So you do have the option to book a helicopter flight to get from Kathmandu to Lukla. But that will cost you considerably more because obviously the distance is further than Ramechhap is. So again, that's something to bear in mind, but you will have to charter the whole helicopter to take your group and you're probably looking at somewhere in the region of $2,500 to $3,000. And then that would be split between potentially 5 people can go in a helicopter. So again, if you are going with a small group, then that is an option for you as well to think about. And we can look at that for our groups as well if they're happy to, but obviously it does come at that additional cost. Well, that's all for me for today. Like I said, I'm going to go back and join my family for their holiday. We've got a couple of days left before we head back to the UK. And then I'm straight out on a Tanzanian safari with the Bucket List Company. So there'll be a podcast coming soon talking about that safari as well. So I'm really looking forward to that trip. But hopefully you found this podcast interesting. Like I said, if Everest Base Camp is on your bucket list, then the flight to Lukla is one of the highlights, but also at the same time one of the main concerns. So hopefully I've covered everything off and talked about in this episode that you need to know for getting yourself to Lukla Airport from Kathmandu, or more so now from Ramechhap. So thanks ever so much for listening, and I'll be back with another episode next week. Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the BucketLister Podcast. Be sure to click follow to be alerted for next week's episode. For more travel inspiration, check us out at www.thebucketlistcompany.co.uk or follow us on socials. See you next time.